Hi, I'm Jamie.
And I'm Amber. I really enjoy designing garment patterns.
We're going to show you some tips and tricks to be more successful when sewing our patterns.
I'm going to show you how to attach the partial placket to the front of your Brome. You're going to need to go ahead and finish the seam between your front yoke and your front dress. Sew that seam, finish it, and then do the top stitching on it. And then you'll fold that piece in half and press a crease about 10 inches down the center front of the dress. You'll also need to prepare your partial placket. It has lines on it where you will sew a basting stitch to mark the folds. There's 4 fold lines. And then there's also marks where you'll be stitching the placket to the back of the dress. This is called the placket box right here. There's also 2 marks. There's a triangle right here and a triangle right here, and that's what you're going to line up with the center front crease on your dress. You want to turn your dress to the wrong side. And on that crease, you'll line up with the wrong side of your placket facing you, that triangle mark at the top with the very center crease of the dress, and pin it there. And then you want to make sure that this crease in the dress is not puckered when you lay the placket down the rest of the way. I kind of use my thumb to flatten that out underneath. And then line up that bottom triangle at the very bottom edge of the placket with the crease and pin it. Now we're going to take it to the machine and sew along that placket box. To sew around the placket box, you're just going to have your machine on a normal stitch length. I've actually pinned my placket in a couple of other spots, and I can look on the back and make sure that there's no puckers on the dress and that the pins are going across that creased line. So I'm going to sew directly on this line marking the placket box. Once I get about a 1/4 inch from the bottom of the placket box, I'm going to switch my machine settings to a shorter stitch so that when I cut open that placket box, it doesn't fray right at those corners. And with the needle down, I'm going to pivot to make that corner nice and sharp, still with the short needle stitch length. And pivot again to go up the other side of the placket box. And once I get a little ways away from that corner, I can put my machine back on a normal stitch length to go the rest of the way. Now it's time to cut open the placket box. The cut line goes directly down the center of that placket box and then splits into a Y shape to reach both of those corners. So carefully cut right down that line. Stopping where the Y starts to split, and then cut right down to each corner of the placket, making sure not to cut any of the stitching. You want to get as close as you can, but be very careful not to cut the stitching. Now we'll flip the placket around to the right side of the dress and press along our fold lines. Take your dress front to the iron And we're going to start by pressing this outer fold in right along that basted line. You'll do it on both sides. The basting stitch is going to really help you make that fold straight. And it's nice to have the basting stitch in a contrasting color because you're going to take those stitches out later and it'll help you find them. Now flip the placket around to the front of your dress. And press it flat, making sure not to press out the folds that you just pressed into it. You'll start to see the nice crisp corners that you made with the placket box. Now, starting with the shorter side of the placket, let me just give that one more press. You're going to press the inside seam allowance towards the placket, and you're going to press a little fold in the very bottom of that placket. So right at the corner of that placket box, this right hand corner, you're going to press the placket down on itself and create a little fold there. There's one more basted line in here, and that's the final fold of the smaller placket. You're going to fold it over top of the seam allowance, and it should be right along that basted line. The seam allowance will butt right up against it, and then you'll notice down at the bottom of the placket, it's kind of zigzagging on itself. So you press the fold this way, and now you're going to press it back over top of itself. So in order to make the bottom nice and neat, make sure you do that little zigzag folding down there. And then I'm going to press it flat. Now I'm going to take this over to the machine and stitch down my shorter side of the placket. Start by sewing the placket to the dress. By sewing along this folded edge that's against the side of the dress, you're going to edge stitch as close as you can to that folded edge and sew all the way down to the raw edge of the bottom of the placket. I like to go slow so I can sew really close to the edge of that dress without falling off the side of the placket. Now you're going to sew right along the inner fold on the edge of the placket, and when you get to the bottom where you've creased that zigzag into it, I'm going to go ahead and pin it there because I don't want it to shift on me because that'll make my placket have a pucker at the bottom of it. So make sure it's laying nice and flat there and that the bottom corner of the opening in the placket is coming out perpendicular to that fold. And I'll actually start at the bottom. Making sure that's laid nice and flat in the machine. And then sewing as close to that edge as you can. Now we'll head back to the iron to prepare the longer side of the placket. We'll start by pressing this seam allowance towards the wrong side of the placket. And then this basted line, we're going to fold along that line and press it flat. And make sure to tuck that fold that you pressed previously down underneath the placket. Then at the very bottom raw edge of the placket, you want to turn it up about 1/4 inch and then press it flat. I want to try and tuck those little corners in if I can, and then take it back to the sewing machine. First I'm going to edge stitch along this folded center front line, and to make sure I don't catch the inside placket, I'm going to fold it away from the front of the dress, and then I'm going to stitch down to about an inch above the bottom of the placket. Just like you did with the inner placket, make sure you're sewing as close to the edge as you can. When I get to the bottom, I want to make sure and stop before I get too close to the rest of the dress. Now we're going to sew a box at the very bottom of the placket, but you want to make sure that you are now laying the two plackets on top of each other. So I'm going to take one of my pins out and pin them to where they'll lay flat when I finish sewing that. Then I'm going to put it back in the machine, and I want to start over here across from where I was just sewing, and then sew to the point where I stopped. So I'm starting at the far side of the placket. I want to make sure that all those raw edges are tucked in so that they'll be hidden once I finish sewing my box. And then I'm going to sew right across, catching the front and the back placket together. I'm going to sew right up to the edge. With the needle down, I'll pivot. Sew down to the bottom corner of the placket. Pivot again. So straight across the bottom. And then sew up right to where I started. Rather than back tacking, I'm just going to sew over the front stitches, and that'll secure the seams. So I pivoted again, and I'm going to sew across the top. Now for the final seam, I'm going to sew down this other folded edge of the placket to secure it to the dress. And I want to make sure that I have the inner placket pulled away again because I don't want to catch that in this seam. Once you've finished all those seams, you can take your thread snips or your seam ripper and pull out the basting stitches. And here's the finished partial placket. It's going to have buttonholes here, and your buttons will go back there, and it's going to look so cute.